Well, I guess now we're being recorded, so we will start it with the prayer, please. It was so beautiful, worth hearing again.
Okay. Okay. May the allness of God love and the nothingness of aught else serve to cover the question of your protection, and the allness of good and the powerlessness and non-existence of evil be the reality of your thought.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Goodness. Thank you very much. I'm getting a phone call. This is quite the morning. Well, we welcome you all to our Sunday morning roundtable, recording from Plainfield, New Jersey. Today is Sunday, June 16th, 2019. Our subject is God, the preserver of man. And I think we're going to go right into the lesson since we've lost a few minutes. Golden text, Psalm 16. Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust. Now, anyone want to comment on that?
If you want to be preserved, you trust him.
Yes. Thank you. And that word preserve, go ahead, Gary.
Well, I was going to say, this is not only a plea to be preserved, but it's also a scientific fact, as Florence stated, that the only preservation we have is in our relationship with God. And acknowledging that God is our Father, Mother, Creator, our life. That is the preservation. And as Mary likes to say, the only good life insurance for a Christian Scientist is to be obedient to and do what God wants for you to do.
Yeah, that's tremendous life insurance. That came from Carpenter. So it's the only real life insurance of a Christian Scientist. So, and I love to look up that word preserve every time we have this lesson because it's so all inclusive. It's to save from injury or destruction, to defend from evil, to uphold, to sustain, to save from decay, to keep in a sound state, to defend from corruption as to preserve youth from vice. Think of the blessings of that, of being preserved. Tremendous blessings. You're saved from injury and destruction. You're defended from evil. You're upheld. You're sustained. You're saved from decay, which means old age, decay of body. To keep in a sound state. And then to defend from corruption as to preserve youth from vice. Keep our youth safe in God's care, to keep them unharmed and untouched by drugs and other temptations that are out. This is all that God does. But again, there is this condition, as we'll talk about more, that you have to trust in him. And maybe while Jeremy is here, we will talk about his forum because it goes along with what we're talking about.
Well, from citation 2 in Science and Health, it says the understanding that life is God, Spirit, lengthens our days by strengthening our trust in the deathless reality of life, its almightiness and immortality. This faith relies upon an understood principle. This principle makes whole the diseased and brings out the enduring and harmonious phases of things. Well, recently I read from notes from a class that was taught by Laura Sargent. She talked about understanding, saying that this is substance. True substantiality is effulgent, translucent, non-resistant. This non-resistance of spirit constitutes its irresistibility. And non-resistance, he wrote the 1828 Webster's says, is making no resistance to power. So I've just been thinking of that, I think there's so many different ways to look at it, but mind knows everything. And so doesn't have to be a process of me learning the truth. I just have to not resist the fact that it's there. And just thinking of this in all the different ways about love and everything has really been helping me so much. And I'm so grateful for all we have here. And I know because before I came to Plainfield, I was all resistance. And it's no wonder I didn't know anything worthwhile. So.
Thank you very much. I thought that's a very good point, because in your forum, Florence, what were you bringing out about faith and understanding? What does the lesson say? What does Mrs. Eddy say about faith and understanding and people who think they don't have it?
Well, we hear this, how can I have more faith and how can I have more understanding? But here is in the lesson, page 387, it says that the history of Christianity furnishes sublime proofs of the supporting influence and protecting power bestowed on man by his heavenly Father, omnipotent mind, who gives man faith and understanding, whereby to defend himself not only from temptation, but from bodily suffering. I mean, how wonderful is that? I mean, we can ask humbly and be ready to receive faith, more faith and understanding. And then we can't also forget ever all the good that God does in so many different ways. And we better not attribute the good that comes to anything other than Him. And it's a beautiful thing. This is Eddy again from the Blue Book, page 61. It says that God will direct you in all your ways if you trust Him. Faith must take hold before sight or fruition, and this faith will, when instructed in divine science, become understanding, and you will have no doubts, but every proof of His promise. Lo, I am with you always.
Thank you. It's beautiful. So yes, that is a powerful statement on 387 by Mrs. Eddy. Here God is giving you. So don't tell me you don't have faith, and don't tell me you don't have understanding. God is giving it to you, as well as being a supporting influence, which I've spoken on many times, and a protecting power. So if you're not receiving it, it goes back to what Jeremy says. You're in a state of resistance to it. Even to declare you don't have it is a state of resistance. Don't argue against yourself.
Before about having 10 denials to one affirmation.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I'd just been reading and this book was lovingly given to us by Candy, as well as being in the Carpenter Foundation. It's the Ira and Flavia Knapp biography by their son, Bliss Knapp, where he said, an interesting letter which Mr. Knapp wrote to Mrs. Eddy describing an experience which came to him when he first accepted Christian Science. She had it published in the Journal of April 1888. During this experience, as he thought on the mission of Christian Science, he exclaimed, "It brings a message of love." And then to quote the exact words of his letter, "To my surprise, a voice, nothing like a human voice, answered and said, 'Where shall I abide? Your house is occupied. Turn out your old tenants and put on one measure of humility and another measure and yet another measure. And then I will abide with you, and charity will abide with you.'" three potions or portions of humility. And this is the non-resistant thought. If it's humbling yourself before God and not making the arguments, not arguing against it, not saying I don't have faith and understanding, but realizing you do because it's given to you of God, and then to be obedient in all your ways. And the fruits of this, as so many of you know, are incredible. So remember this and stay with it. Okay, any comments on that? We're going to get into it some more because others speak of it, but right now we will go to Linda wrote on, the proud have had me greatly in derision, yet have I not declined from thy law.
To me, the proud was the human mind, the thought, even though it could come in a different person, it's yourself, or it may seem to be someone else. And it tries to take you off. I love the quote by William Plummer, which said, God's law is our highway of peace and safety, and those who would laugh us out of it wish us no good. And I was just very grateful for the teachings here because they help us keep mentally alert so that we don't fall asleep and get taken off. Sometimes it requires a waking up, a rebuke, which is good, but it makes me appreciate it because you don't even know you're asleep sometimes. Or you don't know when you're at all.
Yes. Yeah, and I love that quote. Their unhallowed mirth will not harm us, even as the moon suffers nothing from the dogs that bay at her. I thought, well, isn't that lovely? And again, dear ones, if anyone is on this line listening to oppose us, your unhallowed mirth can't harm us. And if you really understood more of this science, you wouldn't deride it. It's only your ignorance. Excuse me, and I say that respectfully. But if you really understood this science, it is the science and the laws of the universe. You don't. And that's okay. But to come and to be critical of us, I mean, I wouldn't criticize what you're doing, and perhaps you're doing it to try to help us, but most of us here are quite happy and healthy and doing fine. Thank you very much. So,
and have a great love for Christ Jesus.
yes,
and
and
what
the
he brought
Bible.
in the Bible. Yeah.
And you quoted a lot of scriptures to us, and we know those scriptures. Maybe our interpretation is different, but it's not that we don't know it.
And our help comes from God.
It does, and God alone. This is a mighty, it's not even a religion. So for your own sake, just go your way if you're not interested in what we're doing. So, no opposition to this truth. There cannot be. Okay, well, thank you for that, Linda. And now, and I love this in Isaiah, hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary, and there is no searching of his understanding. And it goes on, because I know many of us at times feel weary, but if we are waiting on God, there can be no weariness.
And this also speaks to those who may believe that somehow God has abandoned them, given up on them. That doesn't happen either. The truth does not give up on its creation, on its manifestation.
It would be impossible. And that sort of goes to Parthen's beautiful forum comments. And I don't know how many of you took time to read what he wrote about Hosea and Gomer, that story. Did anyone read it and want to tell about it? Or if you've been to Plainfield, you maybe have watched the movie he sent to us, Amazing Love, which is a Christian movie about that story in the Bible. What happened? Who was this?
Prophet.
He was a prophet. Yes. Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Oh, Jesus.
Anybody know the story of Hosea? Briefly.
Well, he marries a harlot,
Yes.
which is rather strange, but he hears to marry this woman, and so he does. They have, I think, overall 3 children, and Gomer, which is the woman, kept going off, and they suspected she was being adulterous. Yeah, but it's really a figurative thing, isn't it? Talking about how Israel was denying God. I mean, not being faithful in their covenant with God. I didn't read all. It's quite long. What patterns, his link to the story is quite long. But I think the gist of it is what I got out of it is the unfaithfulness.
And the background there is that Israel was actually quite prosperous at the time, and Hosea was sent by God to warn them. And he spent a lot of time warning people that they were worshiping idols and they were disobeying God and going off the track. And they all kept telling him, no, we're fine. We're okay.
They mocked him too.
They mocked him.
Mocked him in derision.
They derided him. They said, no, our life's pretty good. We're doing fine. Leave us alone.
Yeah.
And so God ordered Hosea to marry a harlot. And he did. He obeyed. And it was very painful for him because she kept going off having affairs with other guys.
Who were giving her money and things. And he got where he didn't think his children were his own children. They were children of other men.
He's the last 2.
Yes.
And yet, this was God's way of showing him how much God loves us in spite of our infidelity to God.
And at the end, she marries someone who is quite cruel to her. She gets sold into slavery, and she's beaten, and he still seeks her out and finds her and pays for her and brings her home. This is the love that God has for us. Doesn't matter how much we have strayed. He loves us. He's always seeking his lost sheep. So it doesn't matter. And at that point, she was so full of shame and despair. But I think she had finally gotten low enough to have learned her lesson and came back with the 3 portions of humility that's required to curb her false desires. But yes, it is a figurative, but it's a beautiful story. And I never knew that story. And I mean, I'd read the Bible, but somehow that didn't register. I didn't know the story like I know it now. So that whole article is beautiful, as well as that movie, Amazing Love. And it brings out the wonderful love of God. And in this article, it talks about, marriages too, and other ways to show this faithfulness, to not give up on people and to keep loving unless God tells you otherwise. Sometimes he does, and then you have to part company. But anyway, it's a beautiful illustration. And then I found this, and I think this is a good time to bring this in. And Jeremy has put it up on the Noteworthy News.
Yes.
It's quite a story, and I guess I'll have Gary, read it.
Okay, the title of the story is Chinese Christians are memorizing scripture because the communist government can't take what's hidden in your heart. Anyway, talks about Wayne Cordero, pastor of New Hope Christian Fellowship in Honolulu, Hawaii, is praying that American Christians become more like Chinese Christians. In a sermon, the pastor of the Hawaiian megachurch shared an experience he had on a trip to China, where the church went to train leaders. On that particular trip, he brought up 22 Christians from the Hunan province who rode 13 hours on a train to attend the leadership training. They sat in a 700 square foot hotel room with no air conditioning or couches to sit on, with Cordero leading the gathering. If we get caught, what will happen to us? Cordero began by asking. Well, you will get deported in 24 hours, and we will go to prison for 3 years, the Chinese Christians responded. He followed up by asking how many had spent time in prison, and out of the 22, 18 shared that they had been imprisoned for their faith. The 22 that had gathered came from the mountainous province of southern China, yet amongst themselves oversaw 22 million people in China. We forget that there are 1.3 billion people in China, Cordero added. He shared that shortly after they began their lesson in 2 Peter, he only had 15 Bibles, so 7 people went without. I said, turn to 2 Peter 1. We are going to read it. Just then, one lady handed hers to the person next to her, and I thought, interesting, he shared. Once they began reading, he quickly realized why she had given her Bible away. She had memorized the whole book. When it was done, I went over to her at a break and said, you recited the whole chapter. In prison, you have much time in prison, she responded. Don't they confiscate the Bible, he asked. She shared that while they indeed confiscate any Christian material, people smuggle in scripture written on paper and hide it from the prison guards. That's why we memorize it as fast as we can, because even though they can take the paper away, they can't take what's hidden in your heart, she shared with him. After a 3-day study was complete, he asked the Christians from the Hunan province how he could pray for them. Could you pray that one day we could be just like you? One man asked, referencing the ability to worship as desired in America. I looked at him and said, I will not do that. When they asked him why not, he explained, you guys rode a train 13 hours to get here. In my country, if you have to drive more than an hour, people won't come. You sat on a wooden floor for 3 days. In my country, if people have to sit for more than 40 minutes, they leave. You sat here for not only 3 days on a hard wooden floor. In my country, if it's not padded pews and air conditioning, people will not come back. In my country, we have an average of 2 Bibles per family. We don't read any of them. You hardly have any Bibles, and you memorize them from pieces of paper. I will not pray that you become like us, but I will pray that we become just like you.
Wow. I don't even think I can add to that.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
You can put that on the carousel as well.
That's some serious non-resistance to memorize the whole Bible.
Right.
Serious non-resistance and
you have to fix a few of the typos too before you put it on.
and yearning for the truth so much that nothing is an obstacle. Nothing. And look at us in America, can be so self-satisfied, so taken by all the things of the world that we can't get ourselves to read the Bible, to come to church, Yes, we can pray that we be like them. It's quite sobering. And this goes back to originally, God preserves us when we trust in Him. And you know, we can get so many calls, I know Florence and I, people that just want healings. They just want healings. I do believe those days are over. I felt this for a long time. It's not just about healings. Where is your love for God? It's not pulling this chain and expecting wonderful things to happen for you, for your life, for your material life. I'm sorry, it's not happening. I'm not sure it ever did. If it did, it was faith cure, as Mrs. Eddy said. This is a way of life. It's devoting your whole heart, mind, and soul to it, as these dear people that we just read about did, and so many others before us. This is what our country was founded on. Why they crossed the perilous ocean at that time, for this religious freedom that we have, and yet houses with Bibles that are not even read.
It really makes me think. I mean, how many of these people would have any, sicknesses and all these things? Because when you're so into the love of the word like this, to the point of memorizing chapters in there, I mean, you couldn't possibly have time to think of this body so much.
You would.
You're right. You don't have time to be sick.
You know, my daughter-in-law is Russian. She would talk about her grandmother who lived in, terrible times in Russia at that time. She didn't know what the word depression was. They talk about depression. They didn't have that word. They were too busy farming the land and trying to.
They didn't have time to get depressed.
No, had time to get depressed. That word was not even a word in their language at that time.
It's funny to think that being depressed is a luxury.
It's usually self. It's the opposite of expression. It's too much thinking of self.
Well, there is a beatitude that speaks to this, and it's Matthew 5:6. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. These people were hungering and thirsting after righteousness, and they were being filled. And they were being blessed. How many people in this country who are looking for a blessing are hungering and thirsting in the right direction?
Yeah, they want the blessing, but this other part they don't want. And it has to be. You cannot have one without the other. And in Linda's, she said, if I stick with the habit, routine, and structure of time with God, time with His people, right thinking and seeing, and the many other tools given here based on the Bible and Mrs. Eddy's writings, it helps me to keep closer to God and to His love. Well, this is why we do what we do. And honey, if you don't want to, well, you can live your life of materiality, and that's fine. You make choices. But here, this is a 24/7. That is how God preserves you, and He will in all your ways. And that goes more about Parthen's forum. Set your affection on the things above, not on the things on earth, Colossians. The Lord shall establish you and keep you from evil, 2 Thessalonians. And that word, well, the word I looked up years ago was establish, because many times it talks about God establishing you. And, you always think, well, you know what that means. But again, to delve in deeper, it means to settle or fix whatever is wavering, doubtful, or weak. To settle permanently. So you're wavering, you're doubtful, you're weak. I just had someone the other day tell me how do they get rid of their doubt. Well, God establishes you. He settles it, he fixes it. And then he settles you permanently. But how is it done? And then Parthen goes on, by adhering to the realities of eternal existence, one cannot suffer as the result of any labor of love, but grows stronger because of it. Science and Health. And then he says, set, establish, adhering, all have to do with permanence and preservation. Preservation in the context of God, the preserver of man, is a two-way street. Because, and then in parentheses he says, and only because he has set his love upon me, I will set him on high. Psalm 91. That's an important part of that psalm. The first part tells you all the wonderful things that God does for us. But then, because he has set his love upon me, this is also the principal meaning of covenant defined by Webster, a mutual consent or agreement of two or more persons to do or to forbear some act or thing, a contract, stipulation. A covenant is created by deed in writing, sealed, and executed, or it may be impelled in the contract. And then, because, and only because thou hast made the Lord thy habitation, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague shall come nigh thy dwelling. So this, and as we've talked about in times past, the idea of making this covenant with God, it's totally between you and him, but you give him everything, all, give it all to him, and you will see what he can do in your life. But it does require those three portions of humility and non-resistance.
And this doesn't mean giving up anything. When you give all to God, all you're doing is acknowledging what is in fact true, because it all belongs to him anyway. So what it means is stop deceiving yourself into thinking that you could actually own something that God doesn't.
In Science and Health, I'll go back to what we were speaking about before, about being overworked and tired. Mrs. Eddy says, who dares to say that actual mind can be overworked? When we reach our limits of mental endurance, we conclude that intellectual labor has been carried sufficiently far. But when we realize that immortal mind is ever active, and that spiritual energies can neither wear out, nor can so-called material law trespass upon God-given powers and resources, we are able to rest in truth, refreshed by the assurances of immortality opposed to mortality. So, what is spiritual energies? Or what are spiritual energies?
I would have to say it's everything that comes from God that motivates us to do our work and listen to him and obey.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's inspiration. It's desire.
Now, when you get up in the morning, if all you have to do is your own little world and take care of your own little life, that can be very depressing. And maybe, and if it isn't yet, it will eventually become that. Believe me, I tried it.
And it will lack energy.
It will lack energy. Nancy was saying, she found this in Science and Health recently and how much it's helped her. Love for God and man is the true incentive in both healing and teaching. Love inspires, illumines, designates, and leads the way. Right motives give pinions to thought and strength and freedom to speech and action. This is what gets you up in the morning, energized. These are the spiritual energies that don't wear down. It's impossible. They're God-given. That's why some people just, they hardly ever sleep. And they're so enthusiastic and happy with what they're doing because it's this. Their motive is love. And truly in seeking work and jobs, that is always to me most important. What are your motives? What do you want to do? Do you just want to make money and make a living and take care of your family? Or is your motive to bless more than just your own family? That opens the way, illumines, designates, and leads the way. And that word inspiration, I don't have that definition here, but it's something about it comes directly from God to you and inspires you. It's God speaking to you. That's what gets you up in the morning. That's what gives you the spiritual energies that do not tire. Again, though, the covenant with God. In order to have that, you've got to have this covenant and be willing to give it all to Him. If you're just interested in your own little life, okay, but don't expect all these blessings. Any questions?
I think obedience also helps with the spiritual energies, because if you're not obedient, you don't get them.
That's right. The obedience, the willingness, step by step. The other I wanted to mention in the lesson that number 3, Carol, you can read it in Science and Health.
Matter surely does not possess mind. God is the life or intelligence which forms and preserves the individuality and identity of animals as well as of men.
Thank you. And I give this because we often get calls, people with their precious pets. God is preserving. He forms and preserves the individuality and identity of animals as well as of men. And that goes along with Psalm 36. O Lord, thou preserveth man and beast. So beautiful prayers when dealing with animals. And Carol and Lillian were telling me the sweetest story, a little tiny kitten that was under their porch. Lillian heard it mewing and mewing and mewing and mewing. So it's just a little tiny baby. And they were all trying to get it out. And finally, it was a little 5-year-old girl that came and spoke to it and was meowing like a cat, like a kitten. And then the little kitten just trotted out and let the little girl hold it, him, her, whoever it was. And Carol found a loving home for it. So, but Lillian heard the cry, and that little girl, the little child, led the little kitten out while everyone else couldn't. It was the little girl that did. So remember that and pray. Mrs. Eddy says we should be praying for the animals, the birds, everything. Every day, keep them in your prayers and know that they are safe in God's care. And then, let's see, there's so much to this lesson, but one other thing that I wanted to mention. In 2 Timothy, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. What building is that found in? That quote.
Mother Church.
Thank you. Mother Church Extension. Over the heads of the first and second reader. And along with that, from Science and Health on 452, when error confronts you, withhold not the rebuke or the explanation which destroys error. Never breathe an immoral atmosphere unless an attempt to purify it. Those are the 2 quotes in the Mother Church Extension over the heads of the readers. It isn't God is love. It is this. Rebuking error. Hello. And this is another thing that people like to skip over in their service to God. It's all not peaches and cream and cherries and watermelon. Sometimes it requires rebuking error, never person, but error. In fact, many times it requires that.
And exhorting with all long suffering.
Yes. Taking up that cross, be willing to do it, not to say, oh, I'll do parts of this science, but I'm not willing to give my all. I have resistance in me. So remember, you have the understanding, you have the faith, you have God's supporting influence, his protecting power. It is your resistance to it that blocks it. Your resistance. A triple portion of humility. So we will end now, since it's almost time, with something else that Parthen's put a link to. It's excerpts from Judge Hannah's memoirs. We have it in audio, a longer version of this. It's Under Age by Mary Baker Eddy, but Gary will close with this.
And this is on our website.
Yes.
In 1898, when work had accumulated to such an extent that I wrote Mrs. Eddy for permission to resign some of my places, she asked me to adopt a method of relief by taking certain hours each day for self-work, during which I was not to be interrupted by anyone for any purpose. She said that had she not adopted such a course, she never could have accomplished her work. I ask you to keep a time for meditation every day. Ponder in thought your infinite, harmonious, Christ-expressing selfhood and claim it as you. Drink in its perfection, its moral beauty, its integrity, worth, its unspeakable safety. All the truth and beauty of God's creation is yours and you. Enjoy it in sincere prayer and thanksgiving. Preserve your human sense of yourself rightly by dwelling in a definite treatment every day, within the sanctity and integrity of your real selfhood. In that hour of prayer, discard all your sense of selfhood, that is, involved in the belief of birth, heredity, association, time, decay, death. By the grace and authority of God, close your thought firmly against the interference of mortal beliefs. Hold yourself open to the plan of God and closed to the plots of Satan. Rise into the spiritual forces of your own being and destiny. This magnificent spiritual exercise of treating yourself in devoted prayer and praying for yourself will keep you in the secret place which is unknown to the senses and open to all heaven holds for you, and safe. The secret place of right understanding of yourself, himself reflected, is as safe as eternity.
Thank you. I'd like you all now to take up this work about the opposition to our services and the static that's been reoccurring. It's not of God, and we can handle it and get rid of it, and we shall. So, and remember our covenant with God, and he preserves the faithful. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.